So hi, I'm Teresa. I'm Teresa Duringer. You may remember me from such games as Cannon Brawl and Spore and a bunch of others. I'm going to have my info again on the last slide, so you can get it if you need to. And today I'm going to be talking to you guys about game design for VR pioneers. And I want to start out by taking a little trip back to the 90s. So remember GeoCities? Remember blink tags and scrolling marquees and animated GIFs everywhere? It was pretty cringy. Well, right now I think that VR design and development is kind of in a GeoCities moment. So the point of all this stuff was to attract the user's attention to a feature that the developer wanted them to engage in. And this was largely resolved with standardization. So for example, once you started having the login UI consistently in the upper right-hand corner, developers didn't have to engage in these cheesy attraction techniques. In VR, we don't have these standards yet. So I'm seeing a lot of gimmicky, over-complex designs, including in my own body of work, but we're learning from them. So if you think about things like guest books, those eventually became comments, became Reddit, became Facebook, or those animated tractor under construction GIFs, those became beta tags, became move fast and break things, became that's just how the internet works. In VR, we're also generating the pool of features that will evolve so that we can move out of design 1.0 land. I'd say at least 80% of my playtesters in VR are what I call VRgens. They have never tried VR before. So not only do I have to tutorialize my games, I also have to tutorialize the platform. And that's a lot of work. There's a lack of established relationship between players and the platform. We don't have things like on Xbox where everyone just knows A button is action, B button's back, or on PC, space is fire or jump. And part of that is because VR is new, and part of that is because the input systems are coming from a fragmented set of companies with wildly different solutions, if you guys know. So you really need to tutorialize a lot, but the problem is tutorials are largely visual. How do you get people to attend specific targets if you can't tell where they're looking? This is a problem that's amplified because there are 360 degrees of visual freedom, and you can't just pan a camera where you want the player to look because that'll make them sick. So I'm going to talk to you about some visual tricks in service of attentional manipulation. So one of these that I did in the game that I made called Bazaar is this shooting star, and this spawns in front of the user wherever they're looking, and it animates in the direction I want them to guide their gaze in. Another one that I experimented was this thing I call the aurora borealis effect, and this would continue along the periphery. So I could attract the attention of the user in an orthogonal direction, but that wasn't as flexible as I wanted, and it eventually evolved into this, which was this thing I call the Vegas dot system. It's literally just like in Vegas, where you have all those blinking signs. You have these dots blinking in a linear fashion, and that can attract the user's attention in a direction you want them to look. You can also use NPCs, non-playable characters. So for example, if you have an NPC make eye contact with the first-person player camera, and then the NPC look in the direction of the target that you want your player to look at, the player will naturally follow their gaze. The problem, though, is what if the NPC is not in front of the player camera? So if it's a bipedal NPC, like this little soldier mouse, if you want to bring the NPC in front of the player camera, you're going to have to slide them over really quick, and that can look like an animation bug, like they're skating. One thing I did to combat that is I have a little genie, and it's in a floating lamp, so it can kind of swoop and fly around, and it's not going to look buggy if it flies in front of the player. So these are a whole bunch of techniques I've played around with, just trying to get the user's attention. So, animations here and there, animating text, particle effects. The problem is, once you start adding all of these over and over, it can get really cacophonous. It can get really loud, and it can just remind me of that horrible time in the 90s. That time when we had those spinning new animations and the spinning hit tickers, all this visual cruft. So I've met a lot of people who are VR designers and have aspirations, and they want to make Minority Report. Everyone wants to make Minority Report. They set out to do it, and what they actually make looks more like this. Jesse's skiing page circa 1997. The reason for that is because no one knows how to interact with Minority Report. It's not hard to make. You can make that interface. No one knows how to use it. So you're going to implement a feature to try to sell the interaction or tutorialize it, and that's going to work for some people. You'll do a play test, you'll have to add another one. You keep adding on these features and stacking them, and it gets to be quite a mess. So the other quintessential, most cringy feature I remember from 90s web development is the blink tag. This wasn't just about attentional manipulation. It wasn't just about emphasis. You had other tools at your disposal for that. You had things like font weight and layout. But I think really one of the biggest reasons that this got overabused was pure novelty, which brings me to this lovely quote from Jurassic Park, Jeff Goldblum. I think this really, really applies to VR development right now. You were so preoccupied with whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think if you should. So on the web, some of the things I remember are those animated cursor trails, the sparkles and stars and butterflies, animated tiling backgrounds, those were crazy, welcome alerts that you had to click through, cool text. And people were doing those things because they were just testing the boundaries. What could you do with a little bit of HTML and JavaScript? But it was pretty messy, and I'm seeing the same in VR. So another place that abuse got kind of crazy was the sys tray. So if you remember there was a lot of animation, notification badges. If you had ICQ, your taskbar was kind of like a little light switch wave down in the corner before Microsoft put the kibosh on that. It was all about designing for novelty. Well, some things I'm seeing that are similar, and I'm going to talk about my own work just because I don't want to piss anyone off, but I'm seeing this stuff all over the place, are I did this thing where I implemented my UI in the sky, and I thought, how cool, I'll have a literal heads-up display, and this whole swath of real estate I've never had access to digitally in a game before. I had this glittering dendritic structure in the sky, that was the mini-map, the constellations were the inventory. So you can see you would just grab your crossbow after you found it out of the sky. The problem is twofold. One, it's really uncomfortable to have your player look up, and this is just something I learned. People don't like to look up that much, especially at the frequency you want to access your UI. And additionally, no one is expecting to find their inventory in the stars. So even though it's a really cool thing, I just had to add a lot of tutorials to sell it. And that brings me to this kind of sad slide. The point is, you need to know when to abandon your idea. If you keep throwing tutorials and gimmicks at your feature, maybe it's time to throw it away. And that can be really tough because you made quite an investment, probably in all of those tutorials. But you don't necessarily have to trash it wholesale. So one thing I did was I was inspired by Splunky and the Almanac, so I reworked the system so that it was a little bit more of an almanac, a progress bar for everything you'd found in the game, and it was a bit of an Easter egg. If you looked up, you could find it. If you didn't look up, it didn't affect your gameplay. What I'm getting at is that it's not hard to make a VR game. What's hard is making a game with features that are compelling and that it's fun enough that people are going to return to it over and over. And that's because VR design and development is more expensive than any other digital gaming medium I've ever worked in. I've been in the industry over 10 years. That's not just because there's very little documentation. That's because I would say at least 50% of my design energy has to go to comfort and performance. I don't have the luxury of purely designing for mechanics, and that is non-optional because of motion sickness. So you probably are familiar with VR enough to know you can't just port an existing game. You have to make something truly designed for VR, which requires more originality. And that's just one constraint. As you're designing to avoid sickness, you want to avoid panning. You want to avoid things like curvilinear acceleration. You might be used to a nice ease in, ease out in your video games. You just can't really do it in VR. You want to keep your duration short, just so people don't get sick. And these things I'm saying are not hard and fast rules. They're just best practices, and they can be broken. But again, it's expensive to break them because you have to put a lot of time and energy into the R&D. So one team that I think did a great job in breaking one of these rules is, if you guys haven't seen Coloss, they did a great dolly shot, something everyone says you can't do in VR. What they did was remove a lot of the visuals through a stylized technique, and so you didn't see so many pixels going by so quickly. So right now we're on the bleeding edge of technology with VR, and it's evolving at a rapid clip. So that means if you're designing in VR, you're probably working with SDK, software development kits, that are not complete. In my first month working on VR, I had to deal with 5 different versions of the Oculus SDK. It can feel impossible to keep up. And even on one device, you might be dealing with some complex configurations. And again, my first month, I was doing a mobile VR game, and I had to work with 2 different chipsets, 2 different OSs. And the problem is, the priority for the manufacturers of all of those is not VR, because it's just a little bit of a crystallizing market. So some of the hardware resolutions or limitations you're going to be up against doing your VR design and development are that you, especially if you're doing mobile VR, you're going to be designing for the highest resolution screens in the world. At the same time, you're tasked with double drawing all your geometry for that nice stereoscopic effect. You have to maintain an impeccable frame rate, at least 60 to 90 FPS minimum, while you're doing a 3D world with a very limited GPU. And that's a really tall order. So you want to design your game to the constraints. So one example one place you can do that is in your aesthetics. You want to choose an aesthetic that is going to be able to be achieved by the design limitations. So you're working on mobile with hundreds of thousands of verts. That might sound like not a lot, but it's not actually compared to the tens of millions you have access to when you're doing PC and console development. You also have the problem of anti-aliasing. So especially if you're doing mobile VR, you're doing 3D worlds, and you have these jaggy stair-step things, you need to do multi-sample anti-aliasing, which is extremely taxing on the GPU, and phones are notoriously bad at raster operations. So that's going to kind of bite you in the butt. One thing that my team did to deal with this is that we have a custom engine. So we're working with C++, that lets us have a really high frame rate so we can squeeze a little bit more out. But the thing you're going to need to do if you guys are doing VR design is a lot of creative hacks to get the most out of what you can get away with on the hardware to eke out more performance. So one example is that we implemented this hybrid scopic vision. It's somewhere between stereoscopic and monoscopic. So we found that actually, even though you want to double draw everything for that nice stereoscopic effect, you don't really get the stereoscopic benefit beyond about 8 meters. So we just have a threshold, and everything behind that we single draw because the verts are virtually co-located, so it saves us on a lot of verts. And culling. You want to do a lot of culling. This isn't new for video games, but we did it in VR with a kind of a different technique that I think is kind of cool. So people typically use a frustum for culling. That's nothing new. And a frustum, if you don't know, is this pyramid with its head chopped off, and what you do is you extend that in front of the player camera, and you don't draw everything outside the bounds. This is a great shape for typical game development because it maps really well to a rectangular screen, like you're going to see on a phone or on a PC monitor or on a TV. But why are we using this shape in VR? We figured out a more aggressive way to do culling, which is we took the shape of the pixels that you're actually looking at, which is a circle rather than a rectangle because of the lenses that you're looking through when you're in VR. And so what that yields is actually a cone. So you have a little bit more aggressive culling, and you can draw a little bit less stuff and get a little bit faster game. We also have been using retro techniques, so we look to Doom and some other things to eke out the most performance and the most of our games. So one thing that we do is BSP tree culling, where we have these occlusion boxes, and any loot item that is occluded by any other box other than the one it is spawning in does not get drawn. So these are some of the hardware constraints, and another constraint that you're going to have to deal with as a VR designer is that there's just not a lot of units in the wild. And that's because typically everyone has just been working off dev kits, and those are hard to get. You have to apply as a developer typically. So a lot of people usually are going to do a beta or early access to vet their game designs and everything through a community. You haven't really been able to do that at scale so far. So one thing I suggest for you guys, if you're doing VR design, is when you come to a conference like this, make the most out of everyone here, because this is going to be the richest set of people who can act as Kleenex testers for your game. If you don't know about Kleenex testers, this is someone who has never been exposed to your content before, and they're going to be most representative of the end user. If you ask your friends and family their opinion on your new feature, they're already tainted by things you've told them, so it's actually just not as useful. The other thing is, if you're going to go to a conference, VR, it's even more important to tutorialize because people don't like it when you talk to them while they're in VR because they can't see you. And I think there's this weird thing when you're talking to someone in VR and they can't read your lips. And I think also people don't want to look stupid. I've seen this a lot where they're not sure you're talking to them or the next person, especially if you're running multiple headsets. So what you want to do is just have the game tutorialize everything for them and have conditional tutorials because there's a really wide range in intuition for people. And the other thing you really want to, so before I move on, those tutorials don't have to be overt and over your head like Mr. Clippy or anything like that. You can have implicit tutorials. So one example that we did is on our main menu, if you look at the button, you get a modal dialog box that's offset. So you actually have to rotate your body, your head, to see the next button. And what that does is it teaches the player they're going to be looking to the side. They're going to be looking around. Because in their game, the loot is appearing in, all around you. And the other thing that it does that's actually really important is it diverts their gaze. Well, what ends up happening is the new window that spawns is not going to accidentally spawn a button at their gaze, which could mean they could accidentally click on it without meaning to. So the other thing you really want to tackle before you come to a show, if you're showing your games and trying to get the most out of your user test, is you want to design sound that will reflect progress in the game. And right now, if you're showing a VR game, especially a mobile VR game, you can't see where your player is at. So that's pretty tough. And mobile streaming is coming along, but right now, there's too much of a high frame rate dip for it to be comfortable for your users. The reason for this is, again, people really don't want to look stupid, and I've seen this over and over at conference playtests, where people will literally lie because they don't want to show that they're stuck. They don't know that it's your fault as a designer. They think it's their fault. They think that they're dumb. And so literally they will pantomime the actions of someone that they saw before while they're waiting in line. I had one person give me back the game after playing. He had been playing for 5 minutes. He had never even left the main menu. But he didn't want to look stupid. So what you want to do is design your audio so you can tell where they're getting stuck, and that way you can more easily help them. You want to blow people away with these designs as you're showing them off. And it can be really tempting to try to play to the strengths of VR. What can you do exclusively in VR? That's what I started doing, but I think it will take you down some rabbit holes. So one thing is, I said, okay, VR, you have access to 360 degrees. I'm doing mobile. You have an advantage in that the VR experience can be tetherless. The problem is, if you design a game where people are meant to be turning all around like I did in my first game, it can be frustrating for your users who have gotten really used to just looking straight forward, both on their console, their PC, even in interpersonal interactions. People are just used to looking forward. So I actually ended up having to release a patch where I implemented controller support so people didn't have to look to the sides. Another thing that I did that was a little bit gimmicky was this monoscopic experience in a stereoscopic game. So you can have a monoscopic experience in real life. You can just look through a telescope. And that's something that we did in VR. So when you use the telescope and shut one eye, you saw down the barrel of it, and it was kind of this magical thing. You could collect items on the other side. But the problem is too much of a novelty. It didn't happen often enough in the game. And so I think it was just a little bit of a jarring experience. I also have access as a VR developer to yaw, pitch, and roll through the accelerometer. And I thought, wouldn't it be so cool if instead of hitting a button to say yes or no, to let's say accept or reject a quest, you can just nod your head yes or no, shake your head no. So I implemented a system that did that. The problem is people have a really wide range of behaviors if you tell them to nod their head. So you have the deep swoop, which I didn't know about. That's a nod. That can be really hard to programmatically interpret out of the accelerometer data. You have the kind of staccato nod that people will do. And actually, I'd say at least half of the people will do this when you ask them to nod. I've heard that maybe in international kind of a thing. So if my code tries to capture all those behaviors, I'm going to get a lot of false positives, which creates a bad experience. Unfortunately, and I've taken this mechanic out of my games, unfortunately, it's gotten copied and put into other games. Same with the star UI that's gotten copied and put into other games. Oh, am I on the right side? Yeah. And I think the reason there's this sort of community regurgitation of features is the expense, again, of VR design and development. It's extremely expensive and difficult to come up with features that are going to work. You have this sort of utopian share zeitgeist, just because most of the dev kits, again, have been the units have been dev kits, and the market isn't totally competitive yet. So you're getting a lot of propagations of features without vetting them. And we're sharing them because we have limited resources. So typically, VR developers are not AAA right now because AAAs don't want to get into a market that, again, is just crystallizing. It's too risky. So it's a lot of indies and startups, which can lead to a little bit of an indie startup scrappy quality in your VR content that you're seeing. This is amplified by the type of people who are doing VR design and development right now. We are inherently experimenters. We're tinkerers. We're not necessarily people who want to be really restrained and have a lot of minimalism. So you're just seeing a lot of this gimmicky stuff. That's okay because, like I said, all of these ideas are going to be the pool of content and mechanics that we derive our standards from. So I admit I'm kind of guilty of some of these gimmicky things. One example is I have these monkeys in the game, and they will jump at you, and literally they will land on your head, and you'll see one hand on each eye. And you have to shake the monkey to get it off your head. This is really stupid, but it's really awesome. But it's still really stupid. There's a monkey flying off. Oh, yeah, okay. So if VR design and development is so expensive, and it's so, why are we doing it? We already have PCs, we have consoles, we have phones. Is it just a fad? Why are we putting all this energy in? I want to tell you guys a little story. I used to be a PC console developer. I was skeptical of VR. Something happened to me that fundamentally changed my opinion of VR. I have a fear of flying. It's totally irrational, I know that. But the effects are physiological, so I get hives, I can't feel like I can't breathe, I can't talk, my heart's racing. I've tried a lot of things to deal with this. I've tried a prescription for Xanax, I've tried medication, music, so I'll try reading a book or game. Nothing really helps me forget the fact that my body is hurtling 35,000 feet untethered above the ground. And every dip and every blip of the engine just sends my mind into this terror that we're just going to break into a dive and crash and die. Sorry, I'm just being honest. So I get kind of dizzy. I think I have a little claustrophobia, and I like to look out that little window because, you usually have that seat back jammed up in your face. You don't have a lot of agency when you're flying on a plane. You can't really make any decisions. So I tried VR. And when I tried it, instead of seat 16A jammed in my face, I had an expansive city open up to me that I could explore. My claustrophobia was completely gone. The sound of the engine was canceled by the sound of the game. And my brain was consumed by the strategy. I was completely occupied. It was so immersive, I was actually shocked at something that happened to me, which is after an hour in VR, I took my headset off, and my hands were completely dry. And if anyone else here has a phobia that's pretty serious, usually my hands are drenched in sweat after an amount of time on a flight. So this was something that was absolutely shocking to me. And this is something I want to see more research into, the galvanic skin response, turbulence, the power of VR. I know that a lot of people are doing research with VR and phobia, but it's in the opposite direction. It's in the direction of exposure therapy. But I've gone on a lot of flights. I don't find that going on more flights has actually helped me. I know that's really anecdotal, so I'd like to see more research. So when you're on a flight, you can be reading a book or playing a game. That sensory input from that activity is sharing the context with the flight around you. You see the airplane. So it's only a portion of your retina that's processing it. In VR, it's totally different because there's an absolute retinal monopoly. And what that gives you is the ability to completely power the world off. You can opt out of an experience. That's something I've never seen before in my life, an ability to absolutely elect out of exposing yourself to something. So I don't see this just as a tool to deal with phobia. I think it's also a tool you can conversely turn a world on, not just with games, but with education, architecture, medical benefits. So my point is, we think we're going places because we trust our vision. You experienced this morning that you were in bed, and that you walked over here, and now that you're in this room, because your eyes told you that. In VR, your eyes can tell you something different, and regardless of your GPS location, you are there as far as your conscious experience is concerned. And that's truly powerful. You have a personal transporter. So this all sounds really grand. and it sounds like there's huge potential. We just have to get there. Right now, VR design is in a bit of an adolescent stage. There's a lot of enthusiasm. There's not necessarily a lot of expertise. We're just going through this awkward but necessary step in the growth of this medium. So the first step I think we need to take is to challenge yourself to step back. What problem is your feature solving? When I went to Oculus campus for the first time and tried some demos, I was so compelled and so immersed in the experience that I took a step forward because I wanted to explore the world, but I ran into a coffee table, and they told me, don't do that. So I thought about that problem a lot, and I designed my game around a flying carpet because that delivers that satisfaction that you're going to get to explore your world. You can steer with your eyes, but you implicitly tell the user you're going to plant your feet, and you're not going to move them. So when you've designed to solve problems, you can also have other variables that you need to resolve, like your setting, and other mechanics fall out. What does the world look like? There's a lot of variables because you have a loss of abstraction in VR design and development. So some of the first computer games like Pong and Minesweeper were very abstract. They were circles and squares and symbols. But in VR, you're typically in first person, and there are a lot of implications to that. So for one, you've got perspective. You've got a sky. You have to design what the sky looks like because if the player looks up, you've got to draw something there. What did the sky look like in Minesweeper? Didn't matter. They didn't have to solve that. So because of this, we have this sort of forced relative realism. And I'm not necessarily talking about an aesthetic realism. I'm talking about a one-to-one relationship between the player and the game. So for example, if you have a reflective surface in your game, you're going to have to draw the avatar looking back at you if your player looks at it. That means you have to figure out what does the avatar look like. In Minesweeper, what did the avatar look like? They didn't have to figure that out. So because of the larger volume of variables that you have to solve, you have to be careful that your game can get very cluttered. But I think that if you're focused on solving problems, you can derive some of these variables from your solution. So for example, with the flying carpet, my world was this sort of mystical, cartoony, ancient Turkish city. So the flying carpet was an example of a superpower, and as a VR developer, you have access to granting your players superpowers, and this can be tempting to go overboard with. But if you do that, you can create a lot of confusion. One application that I think did a really good job of this is there was an Audi showroom. So my friend Daniel Sproul worked on this, and he had an interesting problem. He was tasked to create a showroom in room scale VR. The rooms were 6 by 6 feet. You can't fit a car in there. So how do you get the player to walk around the car and really get a sense of it if they can't actually walk around it more than 6 by 6 feet? What he did was he granted double distance motion gain for every step that the player took. And that resolved the problem. It gave them this nice superpower. It felt really good to go double the distance. You kind of feel like a giant or really fast person. And you got to experience the car in the same scale that it's meant to be experienced at. So I just want to challenge you, step back. What problem is your feature solving? Prioritize solution-driven design over novelty. A yes or no button is a lot less sexy than nodding your head or shaking your head, but it works a lot better. And that's because if you clutter your game with novelties, the cost is that you're going to overwhelm the user. So in GeoCities, when they were very cluttered, the user can just look away. They can find visual relief outside of the web browser. In VR, there is no visual relief. So you have to take the headset off. And if your player is doing that, that's a big problem because they may not come back to VR. So I want to talk about one different genre of a way to clean up your VR design. So I've been talking about a lot of these tutorials as visuals, but there's another way to tutorialize things in VR that I've been experimenting with, and that's socially. So if you foster a good social experience, people are more likely to teach each other how to play the game. The first thing you want to do is definitely have a first-person camera at human scale to establish presence, that buzzword everyone loves with VR. The next thing you want to do is have representative avatars. So here's me getting scanned by capacity to create a OBJ file. Now, this isn't realistic for everyone to do in their games right now. Here's kind of what it looks like when you get an OBJ. But you can use photographs. And that's something that Facebook and Twitter do, and it's a great way to represent who your other players are without having to have text usernames. Because text is actually pretty hard in VR because of the resolution issues. So another thing you could do is avatar lip sync. So we did this sort of like Canadian South Park style stylized lip sync that will help identify who's talking. One more thing you want to do is orientation tracked head look. This is like such a big deal in my games. So what happens is if another player in this multiplayer experience looks in a particular direction, I can see exactly where they're looking at. I can make eye contact with them. That's something I have never experienced digitally before. You can make eye contact with someone else in your game. But the other cool thing is, so in this comedy game we were experimenting with, I could see my friend look at a card, she starts laughing. I look at that card, I start laughing. Suddenly we have this thing that we're doing, we're in kind of a giggle fit moment. No one has said anything. So there's a lot of huge opportunities here for nonverbal communication that's based on gesture and body language. And right now, this orientation tracking and positional tracking is really focused on your head. You don't necessarily have access to the body. You can put canned animations on the body and put the tracking on the head, and it works. So you should try it. It's pretty fun. And the other thing you want to do to complement that orientation tracking on the head is to exaggerate the focus of their target, what they're looking at. Plump it. If you do all of this, you're going to foster user-generated content. You're going to foster people talking to each other, and that's basically free content that adds value to your game that you don't have to do anything for. And lastly, just remember if you're doing this, you want to spatialize your voice chat so that the person next to you or near you appears louder. I've seen people go over the board with this, so you have to find the right balance. If you don't have multiplayer, there's still some really cool tricks you can do to clean up your design. So I mentioned the importance of telling where someone is looking. It's also really important to tell where you are specifically looking. So a really great way to accomplish this is by employing a reticle, kind of just like looking down the crosshair. This can give you really fine control in VR. But making something like this clean and smooth is actually surprisingly difficult. So I want to get you guys to do a little experiment with me. Let's just say that your left hand is your reticle and your right hand is your visual target. Let's just say it's like a coin or something you want to look at. So you can kind of check out what I'm doing. So I'm looking through the reticle at my target. Now, if you shut one eye, your target's in focus. If you open both eyes, your target is doubled. That's a problem because in VR, people have two eyes. So what you can do is you can meet your reticle at your target depth. Now you'll notice that regardless of whether one eye or both eyes are open, your target's in focus. So the lesson there is you want to draw your reticle at the depth, the target depth. So what this actually looks like is if you're in the city and you're scanning visually along the topography of the buildings, your reticle is actually moving in. Uh-oh. Sorry, I hit a button. I hit this button. So your reticle is moving in and out. Thank you. Your reticle is moving in and out, and so what's happening on the screen is it's getting bigger and smaller. That looks really terrible. So you want to dynamically scale that reticle as you go, and it creates the effect, the nice crosshair effect, that you're looking through your crosshair at your target. I get really into this stuff because I studied neuroscience at Berkeley, and I really want to recommend a particular book from my undergrad coursework, which was called Photons to Phenomenology. This was by Dr. Stephen Palmer. And it's chock full of all these different optical illusions, depth cues, offset, light waves, stuff like this. I use this in my VR design all the time. Can't recommend it more highly. Oh, I'm sorry. It's called Photons to Phenomenology. Yeah, I probably should have written the text. So one final recommendation I have to reduce clutter is to simplify your control scheme. So if you do a gaze-based design, that's going to give you a couple advantages. So one, it's going to be really difficult because it takes a lot of discipline. But what it's going to give you is the cross-platform advantage. You'll be able to bring your design across all the different headsets with all their crazy kooky input systems, from wands to trackpads to keyboards to, what else do we have, gamepads. Control design doesn't really map very well across those things. If you have gaze-based, you don't have to deal with that. So besides being platform agnostic, this is really user-friendly. I cannot stress how much I think things are going to be totally intuitive, and they're absolutely not. I have a game where you have to put the key in the door. It's a struggle for people. But the problem is you don't get that click satisfaction. So in a gaze-based game, you typically get a little countdown timer. And when that's done on an interactable item, you've clicked on it. So it can feel kind of like driving an automatic. It's kind of sloshy. So you have to really weigh the benefits here. And just like with everything else I've talked about today, all the different design tricks. So with all this advice, I just want you to not forget that nothing is too obvious in VR. You should avoid useless novelties. Don't design for what VR can do. Design to solve the problems, because there's still a lot of them. This generation of experiments are going to be yielding the first generation of standards, which is going to be the #1 way to clarify design, a lesson we learned from Web 1.0. So we're getting there, and I can't wait to see what you guys make. And I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any. Yes?
So would you say that still the first-person point of view for most VR experiences are really the most pleasurable? Or, I thought it was interesting that he said that we don't have minesweepers in VR, and yet we could. But do you think we don't have them because people don't like those games, people haven't thought about making those games in VR, or the medium sort of really privileges the first person sort of exploratory environment?
I think you hit the nail on the head with the last part there. The medium privileges the first person experience. So what you've seen from different headset makers is there is a kind of a push to get some of, like you've got Oculus Arcade. You've got things where they are taking things that are not necessarily first person just to fill the stores with some content. But what you're seeing designers really focus on is first person because you have so many wins there. You really get to be in a whole new world. And I think it's going to take a really special design game or a third-person camera perspective to the same level. Mm-hmm.
That just made me think, I remember how revolutionary it was when Tomb Raider came along with Lara Croft, when the big switch came from first person as the standardized thing to then the third person, you had agency with this character. Could you foresee maybe this happening in VR, where you have a character that you're kind of acting as a puppet master, in the immersive world?
So it's being recorded, so the podcast can just get people to ask questions.
Sure, you want to repeat the question on the mic real quick?
Sure, we were talking about presence and first person in VR, and the question was hearkening back to Tomb Raider and how revolutionary it was in introducing the third person character which the user was controlling. Could you foresee this phenomenon maybe happening in VR, where instead of presence, you get the sense of maybe being a puppeteer who is controlling an external character in the game?
Yeah, and actually, I recently saw a game that did exactly that. The whole premise was you were following a cat through this very high-walled city. It looked fantastic, and I think that interesting thing is that this is a cat. And if it was first person and you're a cat, you don't really know that you're a cat necessarily. Maybe there's an interesting gait. So I think those things, again, require something a little special to sell them, but yeah, they're definitely coming along. Mm-hmm. Oh, you want to pass the mic or? Yeah. Oh, great.
Thanks for the talk. It was awesome. Can we already buy the game you show us somewhere?
I'm sorry?
Can we already buy the game you just show us somewhere?
Oh, yeah. This was a launch title on the Gear VR, and it's going to be launching on the Oculus Rift coming up, and it's also going to be coming on 5. That's the cool thing about the cross-platform engine we've got. It's minimal porting work. Oh, it's called Bazaar. Plug my stuff. Yay.
Hi there. Just to the gentleman's question at the front, there was a student project many years ago where I recall that you could wear a suit that would hang a camera behind you, and then you put on a VR headset, and they let people walk around in the real world to see what they would do, and they would do some very strange things. My question is, what would be your ideal crash course to learn everything about what you need to learn about in order to get involved in this field?
Oh my gosh. It's a tough one because even just as a designer or developer right now, there's this huge race to be first to market. And so, I think some of the focus isn't necessarily on the longer term, what would I like? It's like just getting the thing done right now and getting the next thing and getting the next thing so I can finish up the game. And I think that is why there's this lack of documentation. Everyone's doing this. And so I don't even know that I have a good fleshed out sort of set of requests. I'd have to think about that more. I mean, the problem is there's so little that's been solved successfully a little bit. It's just such an overwhelming question because it's like basically everything. You know, we could do better in almost every direction. We could do better with, you know, hardware. We could do better with, just everything basically. Yeah. Oh, do you have the microphone? Yeah. Why don't you just come up to this mic? It might be easier if anyone has questions.
I really enjoyed your talk, but you're really fast. I was wondering if you're going to put it somewhere or where we can see the slides, or I don't know how that works. I hope you can. I don't know if you're okay with that. But the real question is, how about AR? Have you done anything in AR? I just find out. I mean, here I came to experience some AR, and there are no demos anywhere. There's someone from Microsoft HoloLens. They didn't bring anything. Why is AR much more difficult, or is it not good for games, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first one is I think they are putting a podcast together with these talks. So it should be available for download later, I'm sure, just in a week or two. Google it. And the second question, why not AR? I think there is some degree of consensus. You know, AR is kind of the future, and I think everyone's excited about it. The thing is, for one, the hardware's not there yet. Nobody I know in the VR AR community has a HoloLens just hanging out at home. So we don't have access to start tinkering with these things. And additionally, the design is just not as obvious. What are you going to do with it? Mapping games, even though I've talked about how you can't just port an existing game into VR, is not a great experience. I mean, really, you can do that. Like, you can do it. It might not be the best experience. But in AR, you really can't do that. You really have to rethink everything. How does the environment interact with your game stuff? It's just not something that people have a wealth of experience or knowledge in. And so I think it's going to be a while before people really even know what to do with the medium.
Mine is a two-parter. What do you think of 360 passive VR, video passive VR? And then do you have any interest in trying to marry some of the live action footage with CG, and do you have plans to do that, et cetera?
I do have some plans to work with video. I'm working on a couple of experiments I can't talk about right now, but I think that the real challenge is figuring out stereoscopic video in 360. I think that because you can get stereoscopic games because of CG, people expect that out of the video, and then it can feel disappointing if you don't have it. And I think that we'll probably get there. It's just not a completely solved problem yet. And so on my team, so I'm an indie game developer, if it wasn't completely obvious. My team is 5 people. So what we tend to do is really just design to the strengths of the team. And none of us are super strong on the video side, so we're not focused on it.
Sorry, this is, I guess, a little bit more philosophical. So I'm a father of, I've got a bunch of kids, and the older ones are very, very addicted to video games. That's probably my fault. But I just think that a lot of people have this addiction with video games, and I think that VR has the potential to only worsen that. And now I do see that there's a lot of good in VR, and I think that there could be a lot of bad in VR as well. I loved your story about the airplane and distraction and how that totally solved that for you. Yeah. So I guess going back to the philosophical side, as you strive for perfection and work out the kinks, and I love what you're doing to innovate, right? But is there a fear that the closer you get to perfection, that the more disconnected our society will be, the more, I guess, plugged into their virtual lives instead of their real lives. Yeah. Just a philosophical debate on that. And if I think you brought up the example in Jurassic Park. So if Ian came up to you and said, just because you can doesn't mean you should, what would you say to Ian?
I think that is an excellent point. I think a lot of people have that dystopian idea, the Matrix, you're getting fed in some information, and maybe we're just going to go to rot as a society. And that's a really extreme point of view, but I do think there's going to be a lot of responsibility on developers. And I think there already is with video games. You're seeing some people tackle this by putting in little pop-ups to take breaks in their games. And I think we'll have to see where we go with VR design and development. I think that's absolutely something that players will have to take responsibility for, and developers are going to have to deal with. As far as the isolation that seems inherent to VR, I think that's actually more of a result of the fact that because the market is so small, developers are disincentivized from creating multiplayer experiences, and not just in games, like social experiences in VR. But I think that's coming. And I think that it's going to actually have the power to connect us a lot more successfully than any other digital medium I've ever seen before. We're just not quite there yet, and we need to see a little bit of a bigger market, a little bit more money. But actually, I think it's going to connect us rather than divide us.
So you built this in Unity?
No, I have a custom engine.
Right, yeah. You did say that. Have you tried making anything for the PlayStation VR? And then also, I just had a second question. If you had any more notes about sound design, things that you've learned about, integrating sounds and other notes and stuff like that.
Well, I am under NDA on the PlayStation side, but I am interested in all major headsets. I'll just say that. And I'm not sure I completely understand the sound design question.
So you talked a lot about visual issues that you've encountered. Have you encountered issues with sound in terms of placement, or if it doesn't track well, or stuff like that?
Right. I think the biggest issue I've seen is people just kind of going way too overboard on their spatialized social sound. And let's see, other issues with sound. I'm not a total audiophile, so I probably am seeing a lot of issues without recognizing them. I'm definitely coming more from the visual background.
You don't need to go overboard with visual sound? Is that what you meant?
Yeah, you want to pare back just a little bit, because what I don't want is a situation where, let's say we're talking in VR, and I look just a little bit to the side, and he goes, completely, the channel goes completely out. And I actually do see that quite a bit. I think people are going a little overboard. So back off, reduce that effect a little bit. Is that it for questions? Thank you guys so much. You've been a great audience.